So welcome to everybody coming into the webinar. Today, we're excited about our symposium called Understanding STEM Motivation in Context, Multiple Methods, Populations, and Perspectives. In this symposium, presenters are going to explore STEM motivation and achievement among students from historically marginalized groups and contextual factors that influence them across both secondary school and college. And I'm going to be relatively quick here because we don't have a ton of time, but we're going to have 4 presentations and they're going to be in this order. The first one presented by Christine Bay, followed by Allison Cuenca, and then Lisa Hamiel, and then myself. And then we are very excited to have Alan Wigfield here as a discussant. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for questions as well. So why don't we get started? Each presenter will have 10 minutes. So I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Christine Bay.
All right, okay. Hi everyone. I'm Lauren Cabrera, and Christine Bay and I did work on how the nature of questions relates to engagement and self-regulation in science discourse spaces. We really looked at motivation in the classroom context. So when you're imagining a science classroom where students are actively sense-making or co-constructing knowledge, you're expecting that space to be noisy, meaning it's discourse rich. You're expecting that space to be very inquisitive and have lots of questions being asked. You're expecting the work to be exciting and challenging, meaning it's engaging. And you are expecting a level of thoughtfulness and intention behind the work, showing there is some regulation in the space as well. And this is really the basis of why we're looking at the questions we're looking at. So going into science questioning literature, there's lots of different ways that questions have been categorized in science classes. We're using this way because it's a very exploratory approach. So we're looking at our questions open-ended, meaning broad and idea generating, generally giving a higher level kind of discussion. Or is it a closed-ended question or a foundational question that's usually a yes or no question or has one particular answer? We're combining that with hybridity theory. So research shows that mainstream disciplinary science discourse spaces really should be reimagined so that science discourse is accessible to all students, particularly those that have been historically marginalized in STEM fields. Hybridity theory looks at the intersection of everyday discourse and traditional academic discourse and how they can be intertwined so that students can really relate the science content to their own lives. In a recent systematic literature review we conducted, findings showed that the potential of hybrid spaces for creating engaging and meaningful access to this science talk in urban classrooms. And then lastly, we are looking at these motivational outcomes in a person and context approach, meaning we're looking at specific affordances and constraints as they're happening in real time. And we're taking a very integrated approach to both engagement and self-regulation by looking at all the dimensions and facets in which students can exhibit these motivational outcomes. This leads us to our guiding questions. We're really looking at who is asking the questions in science classrooms and what is the nature of these questions. Then following, we're looking at the expressions of student engagement and regulation as a response to those different types of questions.
So because the symposium is focused on motivation and context, we wanted to just highlight some of the unique and particular features of the context in which we're studying these questions and students' engagement and self-regulation. One thing that is worth noting is that teachers were participating in the first year of a larger 5-year project. So this was baseline data before they engaged in any professional learning, in any lesson study teams. This was data we collected just to see what teachers were already doing in their classrooms. Of course, these are science classrooms, so there are disciplinary standards, norms, practices that influence the context as it relates to teaching science topics. And then finally, our study was conducted in urban schools and classrooms. We've really conceptualized these spaces as places of both opportunity and inequality, and that is influenced by various socio-demographic factors, the ethnic and racial makeup of students and their teachers, socioeconomic background, the geographic location of the student's school and also their neighborhoods, as well as more macro level organizational and policy factors that are existing in these urban contexts. In terms of the methodology, this was a multiple case study approach. Specifically, we collected data, video data and audio across 6 science teachers, and all of the whole class and teacher to student dialogue was transcribed verbatim. We also had accompanying field notes from 2 members of the research team. The videos were approximately 45 to 70 minutes in length. We asked teachers to invite us for a lesson where they had intentionally planned some kind of talk activity, because that was the focus of this larger project. You can see the demographic makeup of our teachers in the sample table. And also you see that the data was collected across 2 different school divisions, serving diverse student populations. In terms of the analysis of the classroom video data, we engaged in a 3-step coding process. So initially, we became familiar with the classroom video transcripts. And as we reread these transcripts while watching the videos, we also created segments for analysis. The segments consisted of a question either initiated by the teacher or the student and the following response. And across the 6 classrooms, there was a total of 1,016 segments that we coded. Then we have these a priori codes based on our systematic lit review, as well as the extant literature. We coded these segments in terms of the nature of the questions. This includes both whether the questions are academic, everyday, or hybrid in nature, as well as whether they're open-ended and closed-ended. And then we also coded for whether the questions were teacher-initiated or student-initiated. So that's the application. And finally, we inductively coded the student responses according to the dimensions and facets of engagement and self-regulation.
Okay, so for our first finding, not surprisingly, teachers were asking the majority of the questions in the classroom. Questions tended to be closed in nature, and they tended to be very academic in topic. Then delving more into the qualitative findings, we were seeing some trends along open versus closed. So open-ended questions, while they weren't asked as much, they did tend to be a lot of our hybrid questions. These hybrid questions were linking to student interests and identities. So when teachers were asking open-ended questions, they were being very intentional to kind of link to what students already knew. And then the majority of them were closed-ended questions. And interestingly enough, they were often a series of questions building up to one last question that the student would respond to. This series of questions could either restate or clarify the question, or actually scaffold students to a more challenging ending question. And then along the lines of teacher-initiated versus student-initiated, again, not surprisingly, we saw mostly teacher-initiated questions, and they were heavily academic. We tended to see the academic questions fall into 3 buckets. They were either content-focused, classroom management focused, or informal check-ins with students. So even when you're talking about academic questions, there is a variety to those as well. And then where student-initiated questions were very everyday in nature. And so our big takeaway is the variety and the amount of questions posed in the science classroom can make them a particularly powerful tool for prompting various forms of student engagement and self-regulation. So for our very preliminary results along the lines student engagement and self-regulation, we were seeing with closed-ended questions a narrower range of engagement and regulation dimensions exhibited. They were responding with short or recall answers, or they were replying to the teacher with the question itself. So these answers tended to be very cognitive or behavioral. Whereas with open-ended questions, we saw a wider range of engagement and regulation. We saw when students were providing their own examples, they were being very cognitive and social. And then they were also being very affective when they were making observations and inferences based on pictures from their communities. With teacher-initiated questions, this is really important because these were, again, the majority of the questions. We did see a wide range of engagement and self-regulation. Even just when teachers were circulating to small lab groups, we saw those lab groups being very social or negotiating with peers. We saw them being cognitive by identifying their own variables. We saw them being agentic by really advocating for their own opinions. So our big takeaway is that with such a variety of questions, we were seeing a really wide range of engagement and regulation expressions, atypical than in normal discussions that teachers or administrators would have.
Okay, so I know we're a bit short on time. Maybe, Lauren, we can skip to implications for research and practice.
Yeah, so and we'll breeze through this. So hybridity theory really afforded us an asset-based approach to this topic by showing ways that everyday and hybrid questions can really be valued by teachers, administrators, and researchers. Qualitative coding can really allow us to capture momentary and situated engagement and self-regulation. And then there was a variety of different questions and a range of outcomes. So this can really support teachers planning out a more diverse range of questions to get more engagement and regulation expressions from their students. Because they were mostly closed-ended and academic, this can really push them to kind of show what their questions can do for the classroom. Thank you so much, and we'd love to continue this conversation with anyone that would like to. Sorry for going over.
Great, thank you, Lauren and Christine. Allison, why don't you go right ahead and get started?
Okay, thanks, Lauren and Christine, for kicking us off. That was really interesting. Okay, so I am really honored and excited to be part of this symposium today to present our work on science motivation among Black students, and in doing so, really acknowledging intersecting identities. So, of course, as we all know, a major focus of this session is STEM motivation and context. And from the motivation literature and also beyond it, we know a fair amount about STEM motivation and context. And one of the things that's really well documented in this literature is that women and students from historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups continue to be underrepresented in the STEM workforce. What's also been really well documented is that many theories of motivation, very much including expectancy-value theory, recently renamed situated expectancy-value theory, has really established the critical importance of understanding and focusing on the role of not only motivational beliefs, but also the broader context and their dynamic interplay in order to inform and help us to understand why this underrepresentation continues to occur despite pretty persistent efforts to thwart it. So just to elaborate just a little bit on this very large literature, here what I'm presenting is a really handy and informative visual depiction of expectancy value theory, or situated expectancy value theory. And of course, this model is very complex. And in the sake of time, what I want to do is I want to highlight a few key bottom lines that I want all of you to keep in mind for the purposes of this presentation. So first, expectancies for success and subjective task values are two key motivational beliefs subsumed within this broader model. And what a lot of not only theoretical development, but also empirical evidence suggests is that expectancies for success and these subjective task values are really powerful predictors of the choices that students make in academics and also their academic performance. And just very briefly, just to make sure that we're on the same page about what I mean when I talk about expectancies for success, what that refers to is how well a student expects to perform on a given task. And when I talk about task values, I'm actually talking about 4 different constructs subsumed within this kind of broader idea of task value. So specifically, intrinsic value gets at the student's anticipated enjoyment on a given task. Utility value focused on students' perceived usefulness. The attainment value is the perceived personal importance that they attach to a task. And then cost focuses on what the student perceives that they have to sacrifice or give up in order to engage in a given task. We're going to be learning or hearing more about cost in another presentation. Today, I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it's not the focus of our work, but I did want to make sure to mention it briefly. Another important bottom line that I want to make sure to emphasize for the purposes of this presentation is SEVT and a lot of empirical work guided by this theory really clearly indicates that these motivational beliefs are really important, but they don't exist in a vacuum. So instead, they are very dynamically and powerfully shaped by the broader context and students' experiences within it, in addition to aspects of their identity. So what I hope that I have conveyed by providing that very quick overview of a very large literature is that there's a lot that is known about students' motivation in STEM contexts. However, I'd be remiss not to mention a few caveats that also accompany a lot of this literature, where in particular, within this large literature, there are very few studies that have centered, and I really want to emphasize as well, celebrated the motivation in youth from historically marginalized groups, very much including Black students. And then another caveat that I want to note here is that very little within this literature is arguably known and understood about not just the social experiences that come along with social roles, but the combined social experiences, specifically in this case related to gender and race. So in this study, what we attempted to do was to draw from situated expectancy value theory and to address these caveats that I just mentioned. And in doing so, we aimed to center Black youth's motivational experiences in science. We aimed to contribute an understanding of how science motivational experience operate for Black adolescent boys and girls. And in doing so, we also used a nationally representative secondary data set to measure Black adolescents' expectancies for success and 3 task values, intrinsic utility and attainment value, in science across secondary school. And we did so across 2 different waves in high school, 9th grade and 11th grade. And so guided by those overarching objectives, we are in the process of investigating 3 research questions. First, when we took a look at the literature, we found that very little, if any, research has actually tested the measurement model for expectancies and values, specifically within Black youth, and in particular, especially with Black youth within a large nationally representative sample. So that's what guided our first, or inspired our first question. Second, we explored whether Black adolescent boys and girls responded similarly to expectancy and value items. Again, trying to get at the combined social experiences based on gender and race. And then third, we explored whether students who identified only as Black versus multiracial responded similarly to expectancy and value items, again, to further honor and acknowledge the heterogeneous nature of this population. For the sake of time, I am just going to focus on these first two questions, but I did want to make sure to briefly mention the third in case anyone wants to chat more about it, because we do have some preliminary data to speak to it. So talking a little bit about the sample, I mentioned that the sample was drawn from a very large nationally representative data set. This data set is referred to as the high school longitudinal study, where students were sampled across the United States. And we had a sample of almost 4,000 students, approximately 50-50 for male and female. And what you can see here from the sub-demographics that I'm presenting is that a pretty decent portion of the sample identified as Black. And then also there was a sizable population of the sample that either identified as Black and Hispanic or Black and at least one other race. So getting to question one, which measurement model is best suited for capturing Black adolescents' expectancies for success and task values in science? What you can see here from this table is that we tested a 1-factor, 2-factor, 3-factor, and 4-factor model through a series of confirmatory factor analyses. And I wish I could say more about this, but just in the sake of time, what I want to really emphasize here is the bottom line that consistent with what we would expect from drawing from SCVT and previous work within this area, which has been conducted, predominantly with middle-class white students. What we found here is similarly the 4-factor model, which consisted of expectancies for success, attainment value, intrinsic value, and utility value, clearly fit the data best. And I don't have much time to spend on this, but I did want to just make sure to at least show you very quickly a slide that included the items and the factor loadings. I'm going to switch the slide really quickly, but I encourage you to email me if you'd like to have a copy of these slides, and I'm happy to share. With the second research question, we explored whether Black adolescent boys and girls responded similarly to expectancy and value items. And in order to explore this question, we conducted a multiple group confirmatory factor analysis to test for measurement and variance. And what we found is a pretty simple, yet also really complex and important response to this question, which was not really, no, they did not really respond similarly to expectancy and value items. So in particular, we found evidence for configural invariance and metric invariance, but it would be sort of generous, I would argue, to say that we found at best only partial scalar invariance. And so the really important bottom line to take away from this is that the way in which many of the items are endorsed is not consistent across gender. So just to elaborate again very slightly on what I mean by this, this slide shows a summary of all of the items in which boy adolescents in the sample versus girl adolescents responded differently to the items. And if you see girls listed, at least on my right, and the right-hand column there, what that means is that they endorse the item more strongly than boys. And of course, boys listed in that in the column indicates the opposite. And what I really want to bring all of your attention to, because this is something that my co-authors and I are thinking a lot about, is especially these differences in the attainment value items, where across the board, I want to note that across both boys and girls in the sample, these items were not strongly endorsed. But also, as you can see here, they were especially not strongly endorsed by girls. And so again, I think that that in particular speaks to or provides a lot of insight about the systemic inequities that undermine Black youth's experiences in science, especially Black girls. So very quickly, because I can see here that I'm running out of time, some tentative, for now, conclusions and implications. First and foremost, these data really speak to the importance of centering Black youth's motivational experiences and acknowledging their intersectional identities. Also, I want to point out that we think that with these findings, we provide some novel theoretical support for SCVT. For example, by exploring the factor structure of expectancies and task values within a large nationally representative sample of Black youth. And then also, these findings speak to the critical importance, again, of examining the intersecting nature of race and gender. And one of the things that I'm most excited about with this work is that we're nowhere near close to done. We've actually just kind of started it. And so really drawing from the diverse set of experiences and expertise of our authorship team, we're really excited to continue drawing from SCVT, but also to integrate it with critical theories. And specifically, we're really excited to draw as well from critical race theory and critical race feminism. We're also, as a next step, going to explore the longitudinal relations of the motivational experiences that I just mentioned. And then as well, really in response to calls from scholars like Sandra Graham and many others to shift away placing the onus on the individual and instead towards the problematic and the inequitable structures that influence them. So to really lean into that in next steps for this work. And with that, I will conclude and encourage any of you to email me if you want a copy of the slides or have any questions.
Great, thank you, Allison. So next up, we have Lisa Hamiel and Sharon Zumbrin.
Good afternoon, everybody. So 10 minutes seems to go by really quick. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So our study is the sense of belonging of Black students in STEM majors. We wanted to look at this because, as we know, Black students traditionally have some struggles with assimilating to predominantly white institutions, and even more so in STEM majors within those predominantly white institutions. So this study was conducted at a predominantly white institution, and so I'll go ahead and get started. So with belongingness, as we know, it is essential for humans. Leary, 1995, actually said belongingness is said to be almost as compelling a need as food. So a lot of people, you know about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and not knowing that belongingness is a major part of that. As you see, belongingness is said to be a basic human need associated with motivation, persistence in college, positive self-perceptions, happiness, physical and mental health, student engagement. And one thing that we must remember is belongingness is associated with frequent, positive, and meaningful interactions. So these interactions are very specific to what students need. It's not just whether they fit in. Fitting in is very different than having a sense of belonging. And so this work was actually grounded in Tinto's model of institutional departure, which is a long relied on model influenced by Durkheim's theory of suicide. He posited that student dropout was caused by a divergence from college culture and lack of peer relationship. Now, Tinto's theory is a little dated and comes with its criticisms, of course, not as specifically not taking into account marginalized populations. So even though the study was grounded in Tinto's model, the model that you're seeing on the screen is Terrell Strayhorn's model of belongingness, which takes into account more for students of color. So it's better suited for students of color. So this is why I'm using this as in the presentation. So as I stated before, in this model, he posits that belongingness is a basic human need. It's fundamental to the motives of human behavior, even more heightened in a certain context, at certain times, and among certain populations. And of course, it's related to mattering. So as you'll see in this graphic that I created on the screen, so the student is in the top circle. They receive their basic needs, self-actualization, esteem, belongingness, safety, physiological, which is water, food, shelter. And whether they get that or not depends on how they then react to their situations. If they're not provided those items, and specifically for college, they may experience withdrawal, whether that's actual withdrawal from the university, withdrawal from their friends, withdrawal from their family, which can then lead to depression and even suicide. However, when provided these resources, they experience more involvement, whether it's academic or social integration, happiness, achievement, and even retention within the university. So just to get into the study, so this study was influenced by, so I went to undergrad at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where they have the Meyerhoff program, which is a huge international, like national program it started out for students of color who were interested in STEM programs. It was started by Rabowski, who's actually the current president at UMBC is what it's abbreviated. And this was a living learning community. They did summer bridge. They all lived together throughout the 4 years. They were funded throughout. I had several friends within the Meyerhoff program. They were funded for grad school if they decided to go into grad school for a STEM program. And this program was very important for students of color. Since its inception in, I think, the early 90s, it now allows other students other than students of color into the program. But that was the influence of this study, because I know such programs like that, as well as like different TRIO programs, has a great influence on students' retention and persistence through college. So there has been a number of studies into belongingness in higher ed, among Black students in K-12, but there has been not as much research with Black students in STEM. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Black students sometimes can have some issues with assimilating to PWI culture and within the STEM majors. And so we thought it was essential to study that and see how we could, learn more about how we can assist students with that. And so in 2011, there was a similar study that was conducted, and they found that positive peer interactions of students with similar academic and career goals were more successful when they had those peers. So these are the 3 research questions. The entire study was guided by 5 research questions. There was a quantitative portion, which I'll touch on lightly. But we wanted to look at the qualitative and the mixed methods portion of this study. We wanted to see how students describe their perceptions of belongingness in the university, but also within their STEM major. And also what ways did Black students believe their sense of belonging was enhanced or hindered. And the last question was the mixed method question, and we wanted to see how students' sense of belonging as self-reported on the psychological sense of school membership scale was confirmed or disconfirmed by their interviews that was conducted. And so the psychological sense of school membership was 20 questions in which students self-reported, and I can get to actually here. So it's 20 items on a Likert scale. There were 2 components, whether it's interactions and then belongingness. And a sample of one of those questions is, other students in the school take my opinion seriously. There was the second portion of the study was a qualitative and semi-structured interview, which was 8 primary questions, 8 probes. And as you can see, one of the primary questions was, if you could rate how much you feel accepted and a sense of belonging on a scale of 1 through 10, how would you rate your experience in the university? And then we also talked about how would you rate it in your STEM major. So that was one of the probes. For the participants, there were 89 quantitative participants. There were STEM majors. Among those STEM majors, there were about 16 different STEM majors, from health and physical education to biomedical engineering. So the STEM majors were selected. We went through a lot to figure out what was considered a STEM major, because we wanted to use that as inclusion criteria, because I know a lot of people think that like psychology is a science, and which it is to me, to all of us, I'm sure. But in this project, we wanted to make sure we were looking very specifically at what the national definition of STEM major was. All students were full-time and between the ages of 18 and 24. We did make sure the students were at least a second semester freshman, as we know that it takes at least 1 semester to gain some sense of belonging. So we did exclude those students. And then we had 8 qualitative participants in our qualitative section. Students were sampled from Black Greek letter organizations, living learning communities, and even we went directly to some STEM classes to have them surveyed. Students had to opt in to do the follow-up qualitative phase, so they had to select whether they were willing to participate. And using the explanatory sequential follow-up model, qualitative participants were selected based on their scores on the PSSM. So out of the 89, 29 were placed into the high and the low belonging group. So we left out of the average groups because we wanted to talk to those students that either had really high scores or really low scores and see what was going on with that. Only 16 of those students actually provided their contact information, and all 16 were contacted. Unfortunately, only 8 responded, and those 8 were interviewed. The interviews lasted about 45 minutes to 1 hour, and through those interviews, 7 major themes emerged. And those themes are as follows: perceptions of the university, perceptions of STEM major, individual attributes, family support, peer interactions and support, faculty staff interactions and support, and recommendations. As you'll see, I gave a couple exemplars for each one of the themes, each one of the 6 themes. And at the end of each quote, you'll see whether the student was in the high belonging or the low belonging group. For instance, one participant made comments about their thoughts about the university, noting that they enjoyed the diversity and different backgrounds on campus. This participant was a part of the high belonging group, which seems to be consistent with how they felt about the university. On the flip side, another participant noted that they didn't have much of a relationship with their professors, commenting that they're just professors, people who grade my papers. This participant was part of the low belonging group, and based on their PSSM score, it was also aligned with the sentiments that they had. Not mentioned in this slide is the 7th theme for recommendations. And these recommendations were actually made by the students for the university. So these weren't my recommendations. These were recommendations that came directly from the interviews. A frequent recommendation, and I know we've seen this in other studies, is that there needs to be an increase in faculty and staff of color, specifically in STEM majors. I think one participant was a senior and said she had never had a faculty or TA of color in her entire 4 years at the university. And even though she was part of the high belonging group, she felt like that this was an issue for her and for her peers. And as we know from literature, positive faculty and staff interactions are essential for a sense of belonging. Another one was mandated diversity and sensitivity training, which could assist even those who are not students of color. She actually explained that she thought it would be helpful for students of color, LGBTQ, and even students with disabilities. And so I know I'm running low on time, so I'll go quick. This last table is how we mix the results of the quantitative and qualitative. So as you can see at the top, her name's Christina, is a pseudonym. She was part of the low belonging group with a 2.4 PSSM score. And under each column, it shows whether her perceptions were negative or positive. And as you can see, she made mention of at least 4 of the 6 themes, and of those, 75% of what she said was negative, which was consistent to her PSSM. And you can also see how the other ones real quick. Mary had a high belonging, and for all of the things, she had positive responses. So it was consistent that the PSSM scores as well as their interviews were pretty consistent. Just really quickly about the discussion. Some conclusions. Of course, we know that increased belongingness has implications for a lot of positive things in context, whether it's at the university, whether it's just in life. So of course, we want to continue research in this area, as well as continuing research and with other populations. This is a pretty small population. We only interviewed 8 students, and we were very specific about who we wanted to include. So I would love to be able to create a study where we had a larger sample, where we looked at different demographics, maybe just outside of STEM, increase it from Black students, and I didn't say earlier, these were self-identified, self-reported, whether they said Black or African-American, so they could have been mixed race and they identify as Black. So these are all self-reported, as well as longitudinal study. As we know, sense of belonging is contextual, so whether it's within 1 week or the last month or the last academic year, So just looking at some of those things. And of course, limitations included, it was only one institution and one small demographic. So those are some of the items. I'm sorry that I ran over a little bit. And here's our contact information if you have any questions or want to talk about it more. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And I'm next, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. And all right, so I'm Tony Perez. I don't think I introduced myself earlier, but I'm from Old Dominion University. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Ariana White-Levitich, Kendra Hall, and Delaram Tatonchi, who are three amazing grad students that I'm fortunate to be able to work with. I also want to acknowledge the funder that made this research possible, the Spencer Foundation. So I'm going to jump right into it. So I'm going to take you back to spring 2020. And in January of 2020, we started an intervention study, and it's an expectancy value intervention. Specifically, we were intervening on perceived costs, and things were good in January 2020. Our study was going well, but you all know what happened next. COVID came, and then once March hit, it led to all classes moving online. So I'm not going to be talking about the intervention study in this presentation. Rather, what I'm going to be talking about is, once the intervention hit, we kind of added a supplement to our study, which fortunately was already being conducted online, so we were able to continue with it. But we decided to explore the influence of COVID on STEM undergraduates' experience. So this study was already with STEM majors. And specifically for this study, we had two aims. So the first was we wanted to examine how students situated expectancy value beliefs related to their self-reported impact of the pandemic. And then also, how did their self-reported impacts of the pandemic and their motivation beliefs relate to their achievement at the end of the semester? So this study was being conducted at a large and diverse urban institution. And I think it's important to note for the context that they already have an established online learning infrastructure, and that'll be important later as I talk about the results. We had about 227 undergraduate STEM majors, and this was across a variety of STEM majors. Almost half were female, 45% were Black, 54% were white, and 43% were first generation. So in the larger study, we had a baseline survey, which was delivered in week 2, and then the intervention occurred between week 6 and 12 of the semester. And then we had a post-survey in week 15. And on the surveys, we assessed expectancy value beliefs, including expectancies, values, and costs. And thankfully, Allison reviewed expectancy value theory earlier, so I'm not going to do that here. But we measured those particular beliefs, in particular as related to the STEM major. We also collected various pieces of demographic information, including race, gender, and first generation status. So what we did was we added to the post-survey some questions about COVID-19, which we developed. And finally, we collected from institutional records students' spring 2020 GPAs. And for this study, I'm going to be focusing on the motivation measures and demographics from the baseline survey, as well as the COVID questions from the post-survey, and the GPA at the end of the semester. So importantly, this is students' motivation before COVID, before they started receiving the intervention as well. Okay, so these were the expectancy value measures. We assessed expectancies for success, all three kinds of value: interest, attainment, and utility value, as well as perceived costs, including effort cost, opportunity cost, and psychological costs. And in terms of the COVID measures, so again, these are researcher developed. Obviously, there were no measures like this at the time, but essentially one of the measures, which we're calling COVID impact, was really about their adjustment to having to go online. So basically, since the university had to go all online, how did that impact your experience in your STEM courses? So higher scores is really a more negative impact. But we also didn't want to assume that this, things would be all bad. So we also assessed whether students felt more committed to their STEM pathway because of COVID. And finally, we had an open-ended question where we asked about the impact of COVID on students' feelings about their STEM discipline, about majoring in a STEM discipline. So first, I just want to point out that the measures, the two different COVID measures, related to other variables negatively and positively in ways that we would have expected. So for example, the impact of COVID measure, which, greater impact is more negative, was negatively related to GPA, to expectancies, to interest value. The commitment, which higher scores means I'm more committed, was negatively related to costs. And these measures also positively related to variables in a way we would expect. So for our first primary research question, we conducted a regression of the impact of COVID on the demographic variables and motivation variables. And I just want to note that the condition dummy variables at the bottom are just, we were controlling for the effects of the intervention, just in case the intervention impacted their responses to the impact of COVID measure. So what we found was that, interestingly, first generation students, so this coefficient is negative, which indicates the first generation students actually reported lower impacts of COVID relative to continuing generation students. And also, students who started the semester with higher interest value and higher expectancies reported lower COVID impacts. Also, students who started the semester with higher opportunity cost reported higher impacts. And interestingly, students who reported higher attainment value also reported higher impacts. And I'm going to talk more about that later. I'm just going to skip this slide and go right to the next one. We also examined students' responses to how the pandemic impacted their commitment to STEM careers. So keep in mind, higher scores means I'm now more committed to my STEM career pathway. And we found that women reported relative to men that they were now more committed to their STEM careers as a result of the pandemic. And also interest value. So those who had higher interest value for their major at the beginning of the semester also reported higher commitment to their STEM careers. Finally, we examined how these variables related to spring GPA. And we found that, as expected, expectancies for success in the major were positively related to overall STEM GPA, overall spring GPA. And also effort costs and the impact of COVID were expectedly negatively related to these variables. So now for the open-ended questions. So we coded the open-ended questions for positive and negative responses from the students. And interestingly, we found that, while not surprisingly, a little more than half of the students felt the pandemic was negatively impacted their experience, close to half actually said there was either no impact, a positive impact, or mixed sort of positive and negative impacts. And that might have had something to do with the fact that there's a high number of commuters and lots of online course offerings at the university. So for students, the transition to online may not have been all as jarring as maybe in other places. Although, STEM majors, most of those courses, the STEM courses, were not online already. We also coded their responses for various themes. And specifically, we looked at the positive and negative impact. So students who talked about negative impacts and positive impacts. And we found that in terms of the negative impacts, the reason why they were negative is students reported a loss of confidence. And this was often due to the fact that they now felt like they had to teach themselves. So there was this loss of resources and access to sources of support like the instructor. They also reported increased costs. So students talked about how the workload really increased once they went online. And again, this was related to the fact that they now had to teach themselves, and also they lost access to some important resources moving all online. In terms of positive reasons, really the main theme was that students talked about how the pandemic led to an increase in value. So in all of these responses, the students basically talk about how COVID made STEM either more relevant for them or made them see how important it is for them to be in a STEM career path. So what did we learn? So first generation students were impacted less by COVID, which is really interesting. We can only speculate why that might be, but perhaps a lot of these students were already learning from home, but we don't really know. Also, women were now more committed, reported feeling more committed to their STEM career because of COVID. And this might reflect the fact that perhaps more women were pursuing health professions, at least those who are in STEM majors, and also the relevance of the pandemic and being in a health profession for being able to help others might partially explain this as well. Also, while expectancies and interest values may have been predictive in terms of the effect of the pandemic, it's interesting that attainment value, those who had higher attainment value experienced more impacts. And maybe this has something to do with if the major is more important to you, it's more threatening when your major or your experience in your major is disrupted. And finally, from the open-ended questions, I think we learned some really interesting things, like there were both negative and positive impacts of the pandemic, which was kind of unexpected. And also, I think it's important to note that when we did some analyses to look at whether there were differences across demographic characteristics, that there were no differences based on gender, race, or first-generation status. So students from across different characteristics had both positive and negative experiences. And I will stop there, and I want to thank you all very much. I'm going to now hand it over to our discussant, Alan Wakefield.
Okay, so I think we have about 5 minutes left, and I have about 1 million slides. So I'm not going to show very many of them. If people are interested in getting the details, we can figure out a way to do that later. But there's my email if you want to jot down really, I'm happy to email it as well. So what I'm going to do just really quickly is say the following things. I think what the symposium's contributions have really been terrific in terms of the richness of the theoretical perspectives, such a variety of them. And I'm sure I speak for Jackie to say that we're really happy to see expectancy-value theory still prominently in there, particularly since it started out trying to look at gender differences and understanding why women were less likely to go into math and science. The variety of samples is really interesting. I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I did want to mention the one particular finding from Allison's paper about the factor structure of the expectancy and value beliefs being the same in the African-American adolescents. So crucial for us to be looking at how different measures, mostly done with white samples, are working with other samples. And so that was really an important finding in that regard. The different levels of foci and multiple methods. I saw that Avi Kaplan was in the audience, and Christine and Lauren, I'm sure he was smiling at your amazingly complex coding of that amazing set of videos that you have. My mind was spinning as I was thinking about all of that, but that was amazing. And then particularly Lisa and Sharon's comments about the belongingness and how critical social relations are came through really well as well. And then also the importance of the learning situation. So how things have looked different in the pandemic, not just for students, but for all of us. So I'm going to skip all of my comments on the individual presentations and just go to my 2 or 3 takeaways here. Okay, so the first one is just simulation for intervention, and I'm going to focus on motivation interventions. There's been a lot of really great intervention work in the motivation area over the last 15 or so years, most of which is focused on the utility value aspect in EVT. But still, the number of studies with minority students is limited. Major exception being Judy Harakevich's amazing study back in 2015 that showed a utility value intervention really reduce the achievement gap for minority students. But I think we really need to look at what aspects of SEBT and other things to work on next. And I'll leave you a little tantalizing note that Emily Rosenzweig and I have a paper that we hope will be accepted soon that's laying out a roadmap for what the work in that area will be. Obviously, belongingness and values affirmation, given Lisa and Sharon's paper, would be continuing to be important to work on as well. And then lastly, as I was listening to the talks and reading the slides, I kept thinking a lot about the implications of all of this work for both teacher and faculty development. And I'll just jump to the sensitivity training one, because I thought that was such an interesting and important point the student was raising. But I was thinking about in my N of one experience at Maryland about how skeptical most faculty I know are about doing this kind of training. And I think that that extends to lots of disciplines. So how we get that training to be something that faculty embrace, I think is really key. To the questioning things as well. How do we get teachers and faculty probably to be less the ones that are asking questions and letting the students self-generate questions? Because we found in our work and others as well, students generating their own questions really leads to fascinating in levels of engagement for them. So it was a great set of papers that came out of a meeting actually we had in Richmond a couple of years ago when we were launching this new Mid-Atlantic Motivation Research Group that got delayed by the pandemic as well. So I'm so happy that we were able to present here at this symposium. So again, if people would like my incredibly brilliant detailed analyses of each of the studies, I'm happy to send you the slides from my PowerPoint. And with that, I'll stop in case anybody has a question or two they want to address to the panel.
So there's a question about reaching out through lab's email to request slides. I think probably all of us would certainly welcome that. Again, we really appreciate everyone attending, and feel free to reach out to us for additional information.